At this point, it feels like a pattern where I feel that this author has so much potential, but just tries to do too much and doesn't quite land it. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang. And this one is another that I have some complicated thoughts on. So this is going to be a bit more of a deep dive than I typically do. So there will be spoilers, although I'm going to do kind of an initial spoiler-free review at the beginning, and then I'll loop back with some final thoughts. So there will be timestamps below if you want to make sure that you aren't spoiled. But I make the comment here of feeling like it's a pattern because The Sword of Kaigen, the first book by this author, very, very well known, or I suppose not necessarily the first book, but the big, other well-known book, I will say. I read, and the highs were so high in that book. There were a lot of really good things, but even, I remember in my review, I did something I usually don't do, and I'm like, this is kind of all of the things that I think would have made this better, really, really stood up, made it great instead of merely good, and that I felt like there were some issues there. And even, I remember at the time, the author said that she wasn't going to continue writing that series and doing more because she felt like she wasn't yet at a place of experience enough. And so I was interested to try another book, another standalone here with this book, try it, even though I was a little concerned that this wasn't going to be for me because it's sort of dark academia. But I received this book as a gift and I wanted to give it a shot. So I went in with pretty managed expectations. And I do want to make it clear, I don't think this is a bad book. I didn't hate this book. I am going to be doing quite a lot of critiquing of the book, though, because there's a lot of things that I just did not land for me, or things that I think could have been done better, or in some cases just differently, that subjectively for me would have worked better as well here too. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But I know this is unpopular. A lot of people have really enjoyed this book too. I read this with a group of people. This was Andrew's book club read along. And I knew he loved it. Pretty much everybody else reading it loved it. I was definitely an outlier, but I want to talk about why. So first of all, sticking with the spoiler-free part, this is the story of, we see the prologue, which is pretty violent, where there's something called the Blight, and there's these people that are trying to get past like a barrier into this city to escape it, but the Blight, which like literally, tears people up, is happening, and that's kind of the setup, and they get to the city, and things are not necessarily just immediately going to be better there. And so that's the base kind of setup we have in the prologue. And then the actual story, we're following a character, Siona, who is the person who's trying to break the glass ceiling and become the first female high mage, and go through that, and that's the setup, and that's what we're following. So I feel like the first thing that I will mention here, and I'll get into this a little bit more with spoilers, but for me, the way things were set up made everything incredibly predictable. There's a twist in the book that I saw coming a mile away. Personally, granted, I know not everybody will, but for me, it felt like it was pretty obvious where it was going to go. So that was one thing where I'm like, well, okay, if this is supposed to be a big twist, for me, it really wasn't. And so there's that. But also, the very clear thing that's happening here is there is a lot of commentary. And the commentary is very opaque, very blunt, very, very much present. It doesn't necessarily feel preachy, but there's also just no subtlety or nuance to any of it. And I think that's okay. And this is where I will say too, because some of my other critiques about how the type of story that we're telling, it feels like some of the tropes, some of the story elements just feel like they're things that I've definitely seen before and felt kind of different in this setting. Although I will say that I think partially when you're thinking about the audience for this, a lot of people are not going to be as familiar with the type of story that this is, or necessarily haven't experienced or aren't as knowledgeable about the kinds of things that are being commented on in this type of world. So I think partially if I had different life experience and this is the first time I was being exposed to this, which I feel like maybe many people would be with some of the specific things that this is looking at, it might have been more impactful. But because I've seen this type of thing done before, and some of the things are actually tropes in the way that they're done, to me it didn't have as much of an impact. And my personal preference is for a more subtle and nuanced take when you're going with themes, when you're going with commentary, and that's my preference. So that was kind of the first thing. The other thing, though, is while this is technically dark academia, as I mentioned, and while we're not really in a classroom setting, because this is kind of a postgraduate, it's the main character, Siona, has already gone through all of their school. We're not focusing on that. We're focusing on them starting their journey as, the first female high mage. But there is so much, and it feels like almost every chapter there was so much of these dumped explanations of the magic. It's like you're talking like theoretical physics, but with the magic. And it's not that they're like hard to follow or hard to understand. I just found it really boring. And I'm surprised that more people didn't. I feel like it's the big thing that Sanderson is very often been criticized, and somewhat fairly, for his over-explanation of the magic, where you just spend so much time doing it that it becomes a science. Now, the magic is absolutely science, and that is the way that it's set up. So I think that's part of it. It is meant to be very scientific, and that's the thing. It's all the studying. There's different formulas and things like that you're doing. It's all based on energy and the consumption of energy and matter and all that kind of stuff. So it's all in there, and it's intended to be more of a science and not to be a magic. In as much, so to speak. But also, I found myself struggling to get invested because I so did not care about all of this stuff that was being dumped on me almost every chapter. It seemed like for like the first half of the chapter, to then be followed by, more stuff would happen in the second half of the chapter. So that's also something that I kind of struggled with. And the last thing I'll mention, and I'm going to be pretty vague here, and we'll talk about it in the spoiler section, but the setup between our two main characters and the way that it was done felt like a very specific type of trope that felt sort of weird to me in this context. It's something that I've definitely seen done in movies, other medium as well, but it felt kind of weird here, but I don't want to be too specific about it. So those are my big critiques. A lot of this I just kind of felt was a little bit boring. I felt like things were a bit over-explained. We were just constantly told things. We weren't really shown anything. We were always told everything in the story. And it felt very predictable and familiar, as well as just not really any nuance to the commentary that was happening as well. So those are all kinds of my things. Now, I will say, despite, again, it sounds like I'm complaining a lot, this book is well written, and I can understand why this is popular as well, because it is kind of, the main character is sort of interesting, and a lot of that commentary, again, it's not that I disagree with the commentary by any means, it's kind of the approach to it. I prefer a different style when you're doing that kind of book, but it does, despite the fact that I find it a bit boring, it does move along pretty quickly, and the characters, I think, are set up well. The writing itself is good, and the style, besides, again, just me finding it a little bit boring at points. So it's a well-written book in those regards, and it has some high emotions, which is something that this author has been really good at. Sword of Kaigen had so many high emotion moments. There's a lot of those high emotion moments here as well, and so it hits that. But for me, the highs were not as high as Kaigen, and the lows, while also not as low as Kaigen, it didn't balance as much. This was much more just in the middle for me, and that's kind of where I landed here is more of a middling rating. I didn't think this was bad, but I also thought it was no more than okay for me. With that, let's talk into spoilers, because there's a lot more that I do want to analyze here and talk about. Now, all of this is obviously my opinion. I know many people are going to disagree. I talked to some people about my thoughts, and they did not agree with me, for example, so I know that, but this is kind of the way I see it. So again, this is somewhat review, somewhat analysis, somewhat critique, but also I'm going to talk about specifically I think this is how it should have ended, which is obviously incredibly subjective. So don't take this as me, trying to be in my expert opinion. I'm just saying, for me personally, this is how it could have worked. So we're going to do a little bit of all that, but let's jump in and talk about it. So, the thing I was talking about with the main characters, or the relationship and the specific trope. So Siona, this has a similar feel to the start of Poppy War, but it's done infinitely better than that, I will say, with the character. So we're set up there with that character of Siona becoming the first female high mage, and then when she's first coming in, they don't want to have an assistant because, she's dealing with people treating her differently because she's a woman, and so she ends up kind of as a joke having our other main character, Tomiel, assigned as her assistant, who is a janitor, and he is the Quen, which is kind of like the other race, the lower class. Their entire relationship, this setup, this kind of the general plot, very much felt to me reminiscent of the story where it's it's in the South, and it's the Southern woman who goes to work at a college and befriends the wise black janitor, and then romance is going to happen, which is basically exactly what happens. So the first time that started, I'm like, oh gosh, is this really what we're doing? And that is exactly what happens. And to me, it felt a little bit weird in the context. And again, it's a trope that I'm familiar with and I'm not a huge fan of. If that's not like a type of story that you've seen specifically, then I can totally get like, oh, I didn't take that at all. But that is what it felt, and that kind of look where it felt like that's what it was doing never faded for me because of what it did. And again, with the commentary as well, it's the janitor, and she's like, oh, but no, he's special, he's a smart one. And we're doing the commentary like, no, it's just that you're thinking negatively of his race, and that's just not the way it is. They're just normal people, and all of that commentary, which again, very, very blunt, very, very out there. It didn't feel like quite like where it's like on the nose completely, but it's just, again, we're being very blatant. And I think that's okay. It's okay to have blatant commentary. Again, it's just not to my taste. But all of that kind of thing, that was the type of story. And it just like, it never really landed super well for me, because I saw that and I'm like, okay, these are all the things I expect from this archetype of story. And all of those things happened. Everything happened exactly the way I thought it was going to. As well as, just to jump into the big spoiler, from the prologue, the way that happens with they get there and we're like, oh, we're going to throw you back out if you don't work. We already kind of have that reveal of the horrors of this city. And from the very first description of the magic, where we're getting, from energy from this other realm based on coordinates, immediately I'm like, yep, this is what's happening. They're killing the people and they don't know about it. And so it's just the twist of that reveal really didn't have a ton of weight, because I'm just like, yep, this is again exactly what I expected to happen very early on, because it just kind of seemed pretty evident. And granted, I will say part of it was I guess more of the twist in a way was that people knew about it. So there was a little bit of a complexity there, where it wasn't just that we're revealing this, is that people know about it. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I think with the magic, and so you could make the argument that you needed all of the dumps of explanation about how the magic works to really have the big reveal of how they're determining that that's what's happening, that it's the blight is really using this magic. But I felt like there was so much of it that could have been condensed. We didn't necessarily need to know all of it. I get also that is the theme, and maybe that's just because I don't tend to like, school settings, academia settings, that kind of thing. So if you like that type of thing and you liked those descriptions, you probably were going to enjoy that a lot more than I did. But for me, it just felt like it was really, really overdone with all of those descriptions, especially because you're explaining all of this, and I'm like, yeah, but I already feel like I know exactly where it's going to go, and then it was. So there's definitely that, which I just feel like could have been done a bit better also with that. Now, I meant to film this really shortly after I filmed it, because I had so many things I want to talk about. So I'm probably going to forget some things, because it's been a while now since I've actually finished the book and I'm finally getting to filming this. I also don't really remember a lot of the other names besides like the main two. But a couple of other things that I do specifically want to mention is, the like misogynist character who's introduced in the very beginning, who's just extra antagonistic to her, who makes the joke about Tomil and everything there with it as well. I think that character, which worked, is the exact character you would expect to have in that type of thing. And you see there's more nefarious things, like it's at least heavily implied he's orchestrating the things happen so that everybody has to work on his proposal, and he's trying to sabotage because he wouldn't dream of having Siona actually outperform him. So you have all of that, but then toward the ending, just suddenly making him like a psychopath and a sadist who tortures people and sexually assaults people and does that to our main character. That kind of felt like that was incredibly unnecessary. Now, is it too much of a stretch to believe that somebody who's, as antagonistic as him is like that? Not necessarily, no, but it just felt like you're taking the easy way out, in my opinion, when you always go to those types of things to be like, this is the villain. It's just like, this character is already not a good guy, and there was enough there to establish it. So for me, it just felt clumsy to also add that on. I feel like the person who's, a sadist or a rapist or whatever, I feel like that type of thing is just overdone to show, oh, this person's a villain. And it just feels like it's kind of taking the easy way out. Like, this is already a terrible person. Did we really need that? I don't think so. It just kind of felt a little bit over the top, because there were definitely hints that he was doing other things. But it just felt like we were trying to throw all of these things at once to just make him the ultimate bad guy, I guess, instead of just having him it made him feel more like a caricature than a really fleshed out character, because he's just all of these different traits at once. And so I wasn't a huge fan of that. I do think, though, the the review on the way that it sort of works with specifically having that there's like all of the people who are senior mages, they all know about this and they understand what they're doing and they're okay with it. See, and I think that's where we get into the real commentary that the author's trying to do, where it's not just that terrible things are happening and people don't know, it's that there's complacency and that people are accepting of it. And that's you can see a critique for world governments in general and that kind of thing, where especially when you see, even in this day and age, even when you'd think things wouldn't happen because people would know about it, we hear about atrocities all the time. And then you just kind of forget about it and go on with your life and you don't think about it if it doesn't directly impact you. And so I think the handling there and a lot of parts about the ending were actually really, really well done and really good, especially with people just kind of being almost mad that when the masses find out, people being mad that they had to find out and that they're showing that because they would rather just be complacent and go on. So I think those are some things that come really well here. The problem for me, and again, this is more my personal take on it, is I think where it really gets to doing too much is we have two distinct lanes of commentary that we're trying to do here, but it feels like the wrong one gets the focus in some ways, or not necessarily the wrong one because it's the right one for this story, but it feels like maybe we shouldn't have tried to do both. And that's where this really is kind of something that for me fails to land with the commentary, because we're doing two things. And so the two things, obviously with Siona, we're looking at the treatment of women, and it expands to a lot of things with both just like women being held back. It has a lot of reminiscence of, like 50s US, that kind of thing too, where, women in the workplace were completely looked down upon. You're just expected to be a wife, that kind of thing. And it's very intentional with that too, because there's references to even pre-50s as well, but there's references to a lobotomy. And so again, that evokes a very specific time period, at least in the US, of when that was kind of a normal thing. We're like, oh, your wife's being a bit crazy and is mad about not getting good treatment. Well, better lobotomize her, that type of thing. That also plays more into that sort of time period, making sense with like the black janitor and the Southern lady, that kind of thing. So it feels like we're really evoking that sort of time period, and we're focusing on that idea, women's suffrage and Siona wanting to pave the way for women to be more in the future and that kind of thing, and being this sort of feminist figure. But the problem is we're also talking about ethnic cleansing and genocide of other races, and that is much less of a focus, and the two are compared way too often, in my opinion, to have any of the commentary end up really landing that well. There are even times where Siona's like, I know I shouldn't compare me being a woman in a man's world to, Tamil, whose race is being slowly destroyed and killed off by our magic, but gosh, they both are really bad. And that's just where I don't think at all the author is really trying to compare the two. But when you're including both of these elements and one is just infinitely worse than the other one, but that's not the focus of your story, that is something I really, really struggled with that to get in, because we're still focusing, we still have scenes, there's even like a comment like, from the Marvel scene with like, it's a girl thing, there's a comment like that later on that happens in the book too. And so we're really focusing, we're trying to take that, the feminist approach and have that be focused. I think that's great. And I think those themes fit this story really well. But then also the fact that we're doing the sort of like the racial genocide thing where they're killing all of these other people that aren't in their city, and even within the city, they're working them to death, they're treated terribly. It's just, that's the much worse thing. And so it feels like we really should be focusing more on that commentary, but we're not. And so I really struggled with that here, and that really kind of took me out, because I'm just like, you've revealed something that's so much worse, and yet we're still spending all of the time on the still bad thing, but not nearly as bad. And so that's where it really kind of took me out. Now, I will note again, so the ending, I did like the ending overall, because it doesn't take the easy way out and have them succeed, and like, we're gonna pave a way for a better tomorrow. Siona, the main character, dies. That fits in, and honestly, I also did find predictable because of the conversations with Tamil about how, their religion is not about the intention, it's about the actual good or bad you do, and if you do bad, even if you had good intentions, you still go to hell, basically. So Siona dying is kind of like that atonement being what she deserves because she was part of the bad thing, even though she had good intentions. Fit thematically, made sense. I saw it coming. I still liked it. I thought that part was well done, but I don't think that this has like the bold ending. I don't think the twist or the ending are that bold because it feels to me, this is the part that's the most subjective, I will know, but it feels like some punches are pulled because personally, the way that I would have ended this book that takes it a step further is they accomplish nothing. Siona tries to do all this. She gets caught. She gets lobotomized, and she just becomes, the subservient woman that they wanted her to be. The Quen, maybe they still riot, but then nothing really changes, and it just kind of shows that would have been a very grim and a very dark way to end it. But I feel like that would have been the bold thing to show that it's sometimes everything's so entrenched that it takes more than that type of thing. And so the kind of the partial success, I think it worked and it was a good ending, and it's a more satisfying ending for sure than what I'm proposing. But I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. But that's kind of, I kept thinking, I'm like, man, wouldn't that be a crazy ending if she actually went for that? And I didn't think that was going to happen. I was pretty positive it wasn't. If it actually would have happened, I would have been shocked, and that actually probably would have upped the whole thing for me just a little bit, because that would have been such a bold way to do it, to kind of just put that in, albeit bleak. But that felt like, so it still felt like the way that it did ended was still kind of pulling some punches a little bit for me, because I feel like it could have just gone so much further with those central themes in the ideology. And also the kind of the ending with the Quen leaving and being like, we're just leaving, we're gonna go off on our own into this super inhospitable place where we might all die anyway. For me, like, that felt very flat, because like, okay, so we're not even gonna try to do the, like, they're gonna fight and try to make things better in the city, but they're just going to go off, and many of them are just going to die because it's barren and inhospitable because of the years of both people and livestock and every plants, animals, whatever, being killed. And so I'm just like, what are we trying to accomplish with that? Is that just trying to be, because it's played off as an almost like a hopeful thing, like they're going to forge their own new path. But like, no, most of them are going to die. Like, that didn't feel like that was necessarily giving like the satisfying ending either. So that part felt a little off to me. But again, that's my very like subjective, like, I think for me that would have been a better ending personally, that I would have been like, whoa, that was crazy. And so I didn't really quite get that, and instead I got the ending that I expected, albeit I think is still overall well done. Like I said, I didn't hate this book, I didn't hate the ending, but there's just so many pieces here that I felt like were good but could have been better with some changes. I think with the commentary maybe focusing on one of those things would have made it better, because then you could really focus and not have to split time. Because I feel like with the reveals of the atrocities that are happening, we still are not spending a lot of time there. We aren't spending a lot of time with the Quen side, with seeing this. We're finding out these terrible things, but we're not really exploring that, because this is Siona's story. And Siona's story is, of course, going to take the forefront, as it should. It's her story. But when you're showing like, oh, there's this so much worse thing happening, and you're not focusing on that, for me, that just takes away from the strength or the overall impact of your main storyline of focusing on that as well. And so that's just where I feel like the author tried to do too much, and it, for me, did not really land. And just with some changes to this, I feel like this could have been great. It still might not have been for me, and I did know going in that this probably wasn't going to be for me, but it's again where I just feel like there's so much, this author has so much talent, and they're a great writer. They do some really great things, but it just, again, this is another book where I just feel like it could have been so much more, and unfortunately for me, it was not. But so I'm going to go into my final thoughts here fully, and it'll be non-spoiler from this part, non-spoiler slightly before this, but it's again, I feel like with this book, if we would have tried to have more of a focus on one particular bit of the commentary or thematically there, and not tried to split it and not share enough time, working on being a little bit more subtle with the themes for me is a big thing that I think would have helped as well. But also, I just think if you're going to go for the big, bold finish, go for it. Don't halfway there. Just go for it, because for me, I felt like there could have been more impactful things happening really there, and it just didn't quite hit it for me. And that's ultimately where I landed on this one. I do think this is a good book. I don't think it's a great one. And for me, it's not anything that's going to be particularly memorable for me, I don't think, because again, A lot of it was very familiar. I found it very predictable and overstated, very, very much. Too much telling, not enough showing a lot of those things, as well as I kind of talked about with some of those pieces. So for me, it's not a read that's going to really stick with me, although I can see why it might with others. And it's where I don't know. I honestly don't know if I'll read another M.L. Wang book, because it seems like even the things that are like good are just not enough to outweigh the other things I'm not a fan of. So maybe this is just an author that's not for me. Although there's a lot of talent there, so I hate to say that, because I certainly didn't hate this, and Kaigen I liked more than this overall, even though I think the lows were lower, the highs were higher, as I kind of said too. But yeah, that's kind of where I landed. So I know this was a bit of a deep dive, and I know this is going to be another unpopular opinion, go figure, for me, because this is a really popular book, and as I said, I see a lot of reasons for that, but I had a lot of issues with it too, and that's kind of just what I wanted to talk about and dissect and do a little bit of a deeper dive on why I had so many problems with this book and why it didn't quite work for me. So hopefully this was interesting to you, for people who've read the book, or if you watched it anyway, I guess interesting to find out more about it. But those are really my thoughts on Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. Let me know. I would love to hear from you. Like I said, I assume most people would disagree, but agree, disagree, let me know. I'd love to hear from you and just your thoughts on any of the things that I talked about, or if you took it completely differently, let me know. I'd love to have that conversation with you down in the comments. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description, as always, for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizard of the Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether this book, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.